This week's episode of the Rural Woman Podcast is brought to you by the patrons of the Rural Woman Podcast. This amazing group of individuals contribute financially to the Rural Woman Podcast to ensure the stories of women in agriculture hit your earbuds each and every week. Want to join them in supporting the stories of women in agriculture while getting access to extended episodes, patron-only episodes, and other great perks? Head on over to wildrosefarmer.com to learn more about how you can become a patron through Patreon. Hi, I'm Caitlin Dubin, and this is the Rural Woman Podcast. I'm a first-generation farmer who married into agriculture. Born and raised in a city, I was so unfamiliar with where my food came from, but I was determined to figure it out. Through my journey into agriculture, I saw women who were strong but humble, often taking a back seat. To me, these women were leaders who deserved a seat at the table. I created the Rural Woman Podcast to share the voices of women in an industry whose stories often went untold. The rural entrepreneurs who live and breathe their work, full of grit and pride. We come here to share our stories, to be in community with each other, to be challenged and inspired, but most importantly, to be celebrated and to be heard. We may not all live, farm, ranch, or homestead the same, but we are all connected. We are rural women, and our stories are worthy of being told. Hey friends, we are celebrating the 5th anniversary of the Rural Women Podcast this year, and we are taking a look back through the inspiring stories that have been shared with us throughout the years. Looking back through these interviews, there are women who have been successful, who have persevered, and who have been resilient. There are women who have shared their stories who may not farm or ranch or homestead or work in the business that they used to. Things may be different for them now, but I know their stories have impact. And I hope that this is a solid reminder for those of you who have shared your stories or who are inspired to share your stories. Our stories are forever changing. And just because we may not farm, ranch, or homestead the same, our lives might not look the same. There has been growth here. Through the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think it's a solid reminder for all of us to look back to see how far we've come. So my friends, I hope you enjoy these throwback podcast episodes coming your way, and thank you for being here and for helping me celebrate the incredible stories of women in agriculture through the Rural Woman Podcast over the last 5 years. Enjoy. Today, you'll meet Sierra Seidner.
So I'm Sierra Seidner, and I actually grew up in town. My mom lived in town and we went to a small high school, but I spent a lot of time on my great-grandparents' farm, and they had 30 acres and they had horses. So that's kind of where I fell in love with horses and everything like that. And like I said, great-grandparents, and I was pretty much glued to my grandpa. So he's really the one who taught me the value of hard work and everything like that.
Oh, that's so great. So tell us more about Iron Horse. It's a company that's been around for a very long time, and to get that and to have all of that knowledge under your belt, like, it is a great fit for you to have. So tell us more about Iron Horse and the different supplements and everything that you have available.
Yeah, like I said, it's been around for a while. Dr. Swaney had started it in 1967. It was shortly after he got out of vet school. And the way he started it was he was looking at some of the other products, and he was just basically like, oh, well, I can make something better and more affordable than what these people are selling. So that's kind of like how he got his start. But as I was mentioning, we cast a pretty broad net of products. So, we're Iron Horse. So obviously horses are our big focus, but, we have stuff for sheep, chickens, cows. Hoof and Sole is our best seller. That's for horses with hoof issues. So it'll help thicken the hoof walls if they have thin soles, things like that. And then like our all-purpose mineral, that's something that people really feed the cows. So if they mix their own feed, then it comes in a 50-pound bag. So you just stick a 50-pound bag right in a ton batch of feed. And that's for the dairy farmers, it's been a good thing because it's shown to increase the milk fat by like 10%. So a big increase in your milk fat there when you're making cheese. That's pretty important. And then, like I mentioned, we have stuff for sheep. So we have the KAO. It's a vitamin trace supplement. So it's just basically a mineral conditioner for sheep and goats. And it doesn't have copper because they're copper sensitive animals. And then a newest thing that we started over the summer was egg enhancer. So this is for chickens, laying chickens specifically. They, especially this time of year, the chickens like to go on strike and don't want to lay because it gets colder and they molt and everything. So this kind of helps. It boosts their vitamin intake to help with the egg production. So you'll see an increase in egg production. And then you'll also see an increase in like the egg size as well by about 7%. And a funny story on the egg enhancer, when we were testing it for a while, our friend and realtor, she has ostriches. So I was like, hey, people are really seeing a good results with this with their chickens. Why don't you try it on Aggie and see what happens to her ostrich eggs? So she tried it, and like after about a month, her ostrich eggs gained like half a pound. So it was pretty incredible. And so ostriches, they have a specific laying season, I guess. And I didn't know this, but they lay from like April to September-ish. And here in November, Aggie is still laying, getting the egg enhancer supplement. So that's pretty cool. The ostrich story is like my favorite of all time.
Today, you'll meet Dr. Tammy Gray-Steele.
I am a native Oklahomian, born and raised on a farm that was actually awarded to my family through Emancipation Proclamation, the 40 acres and the mule. So I am a offspring or a shoot, if you will, from farmers that currently my family still farm on the initial 40 acres. As I tell people, unfortunately, we no longer have the mule, but we have different mules that come around. No pun intended. But we still farm the 40 acres. And collectively, my family now have almost 2,600 acres collectively as a family. And they run beef cattle.
So tell me about growing up, on this farm. What were the roles and, the visions that you had for women on farms, and what were they doing rurally that you looked up to and what you saw as what a rural woman was to you?
Well, I saw women on their farms that they had an asset. And I'm thinking, I want them to hold on to that asset, to pass it to the next generation, to their offsprings. They didn't realize what an asset they had as being just landowners and what they could do with the land. So what we did, and I say we, my team at the time, we went in and started researching and finding resources with the federal government, even starting with our own local Department of Agriculture. Oklahoma Department of Agriculture at the time had grants, and they still do, for individual farmers to access some resources anywhere from $5,000 up to $10,000. And it was much lower than then. I think at the time then it was like $1,500 to $3,000 when we started getting these mini grants, if you will. We started getting grants, literally doing the paperwork for the farm women and giving them that asset and letting them diversify from what they were already doing. Like we started peach orchards, blueberries, blackberries, strawberry farms that with these women. And they were excited because they were like, wow, we could really do. And it gave them something to be proud of. So just being able to help them develop their farms and make an income and just be a part of society where they felt that they weren't. They were just kind of sitting there wilting away, basically, because no one was paying attention to them, especially as being a minority woman. And that's another hurdle that I always tell people. Yes, I'm a woman, but try to be dual minority. It's really tough.
This week, you'll meet Justine Berry.
I grew up on my parents' cattle ranch, and I guess I grew up with my younger and older sister. There's 3 of us. And so we were always involved in beef 4-H, as well as super helpful on the ranch because we were the boys. And then I got married in 2017, and my husband and I purchased land and kind of adjacent to my parents, and joined the ranch in that way. So we run all of our cattle together as if it's one, and collaborate with them.
I want to know, what does it mean to you and your operation to be a regenerative operation? And what does regenerative agriculture mean to you?
Gosh, well, I'm definitely not going to give you a good textbook answer like Gabe Brown would give.
Good. I don't want that.
Like the quick and dirty. So essentially to us, like, regenerative agriculture is basically rejuvenating the land and building the soil to create a sustainable ecosystem. So essentially, you don't have to break up the land to, add diversity. Like, lots of people say, oh, we need to break up the hayland because it's becoming unproductive. So it's an old stand. We need to break it up and seed it again, add in the diversity again. And so really what we're trying to do is, without disturbing that soil, adding in all the things that it needs and making that like a healthy ecosystem below the ground, in order to essentially not have the cost of constantly breaking it up. Just for us, we don't have that equipment. And so that it didn't make sense on that kind of financial front. So that was one of the reasons, we were kind of torn or like pulled in this direction. And then once we kind of were led down this pathway, it's like, holy cow, it seems like such basic stuff. Once we get talking about it or learn more about it every day, you'll like listen to a podcast, like, oh my God, why didn't I think about that? Like, that makes so much more sense.
This week, you'll meet Emily Reuschel.
Okay, let's see. So my husband and I live on his family farm here in West Central Illinois. I did not grow up in agriculture. As I like to say, I married a farmer. Farms don't move, so people do. So that's how we are here. We've been back at the family farm since 2016. And I didn't have an incredible expectation of necessarily what that was going to be like. I certainly didn't necessarily see myself existing in the space of agriculture outside of, being a farm wife and raising farm kids. I actually grew up about 2.5 hours south of here in what I thought was a small town outside of St. Louis, which is a pretty big city. And professionally, I was an elementary school teacher for 5 years. I taught 4th grade before leaving the classroom unexpectedly to work at our local YMCA for 4 years. I was a program director, and it was during my time at the Y that I started my own personal growth and health journey. I just really wanted to learn to take care of myself and have energy and feel good in my body. So that turned into discovering personal growth and podcasts and personal development books, and just really snowballed into me starting to share online, first of all, to connect with other farm wives, women who were from rural communities who understood what our life was like here, but also finding people who were interested in this kind of new world I had immersed myself in personal growth and personal development.
So take us through the process of what it was like for you to learn these skills.
Yeah, well, I think that's such a good point, and something I'm actually really, really passionate about, because our whole life we have been told how to be, how to act, how to dress, how to work out, how to eat, like all of these things. And one thing that I have really struggled with is like, everyone says like, find your niche, talk about your thing. And I'm like, what works for me doesn't work for someone else. Like, what I care the most about is igniting a spark that prompts women, specifically in rural communities, to get clear on what they actually want and to do that thing. I can share, here are 5 things that I do in the morning that start my day for success, but that doesn't mean it's right for you. It's why my habit challenge is called You Do You 82, because it's meant for you to choose the habits that you actually need to build or break for your lifestyle. And so it's a journey. It's a process. It's trying different things. It's getting inspired. But most importantly, it's continuously asking yourself, what do I actually want? Or what do I actually need? Not what my mother-in-law thinks, not what my best friend told me, not what my sister is doing, not what this chick on the internet says is best. What do I actually want? And that transcends every part of our life, whether it's career, whether it's health, whether it's, personal development, whether it's parenting or marriage. It's what do I actually want? What makes the most sense for me? And that requires a level of vulnerability and honesty, and sometimes coming to realizations that feel hard. But the more that we can turn inward and look to our inner guidance outside of what everyone else is telling us that we should do, like that's where we find our path. And that's where, we go down what's meant for us.
This week, you'll meet Megan Callahan.
Yeah, I'm Megan Callahan. I am living in St. Ignatius, Montana. It's right between Missoula and Kalispell. It is a generational farm that my husband's grandfather bought in the 50s. They grew potatoes for right up until 2001. And then they got out of the business and leased the land until my husband and I were ready to come home and start our adventure on the farm. So I grew up in northern Minnesota, the frozen tundra of hell, north of Duluth, and I was a horse kid in 4-H, and that's not really a big thing up there. There's not very many of us, but I sure had dreams about moving out west. And when I did, I met my husband, and we just hit it off, and we're still here. We've been married going on 7 years now, together for 10. And we have quite the adventure going on the family farm. So I'm happy to share with you guys.
Well, tell us more about your operation, and your ranch's name is Lazy DC Bar Ranch. So tell us more about the ranch, what you have on there, and what your operation looks like today.
Yes. So my husband's grandfather bought the brand in the 1950s, Lazy DC Bar. His name was Dan Callahan, and he got the brand, and we decided what better way to name the ranch and go with it than buy the brand and utilize it. So that's where our name started off. And we have a menagerie of animals, but mainly we breed mules. We have 2 mammoth jacks currently that we use, a few head of brood mares, and some milk cows. We give riding lessons. We put up commercial hay. And then we do sell family milk cows when we happen upon them. So yeah, we just have a blast breeding mules, and we rescue a lot of mules also out of auctions, or maybe mules that are misunderstood and need a home.
You can help support the stories of women in agriculture to be shared through the Rural Woman podcast on Patreon. What is Patreon? It's a membership-based platform that helps fund and support creators like me to create and produce content like this that you all love. New to the Rural Woman podcast Patreon is ad-free listening and patron-only bonus content and exclusive episodes. Learn more and join the patron gang today at patreon.com/the Rural Woman podcast. Today, you'll hear from Sarah Riedner.
Let's see, who am I? First of all, I'm a first generation farmer. So I know a lot of people can relate to that more and more these days. But obviously that means came into this with no farming background. My husband is also a first generation farmer. So neither one of us had any experience really. And we currently live in Didsbury, Alberta, and our farm is just outside of town. But I was born and raised in Calgary, and made the move to Didsbury just this last summer, which is a bit surprising that it took this long to finally get out to the country officially. But yeah, we got into farming. It was a bit of a long road to get to the point we're at right now, obviously. But it mostly just started because I grew up, my mom had a little veggie garden, and we would just grow basic carrots and peas and things like that as kids. And so I just always had that around. And same with my husband. His mom was a big green thumb, and so was his grandma. And so it didn't ever occur to me that people didn't realize how food was grown, or like had no concept around how food gets to your table. And we were thinking about, you know, starting a family eventually and what that would look like. And it was, wow, like, we can't raise kids like that. Like that, we had like what these generations have to know where food comes from. And I want to know more. Like, I mean, I just know the basics, but I want to know the rest of the process.
So what have been some of the most significant changes that you've seen in the land since you first started your rotational grazing with the livestock?
For sure, variety of the different plants and grasses that are growing out there. I mean, we seeded it with like a huge variety of different grasses. And then since then have just like broadcast, like hand seeded in random things to help as we got to know the cattle and some of their needs. But yeah, just to be able to look out now and see the variety that is coming up on its own, and the bare spots are starting to fill in where they had just really been hit hard. We weren't sure how much they would recover in some areas. And then the organic matter has gone up. We do soil testing every year on that, or every other year, depending on. And it's an ecosystem now. Like, it's not just these fenced in areas where there's a pond and some natural areas like an old beaver dam and things like that, which we keep protected. But now the rest of the farm is also an ecosystem. Like, there's salamanders and frogs all over the place. And like, it's just, and that wasn't there when we first, like the first 2 years that we were doing this, you didn't see anything like that. And so to it's the noticing the stuff underneath your feet as you're walking through, and like, oh, wow, that's starting to come up. Like, or you can start to see these animals. And that's been the most rewarding part of some of the changes that we made, is to actually see it coming back as an ecosystem.
Today, you'll meet Lindsay Hamilton.
So my name is Lindsay Hamilton. I'm from the rural community of Queil, Quebec, which I don't have a French accent, but because I am a fifth generation, my children are the sixth generation of our family farm here in Quebec. And we are from Irish descent. And so we live in a community with a lot of Irish descent and descendants. And we actually are very English in this community, despite being Quebec based. We have worked on this farmland for many generations. It primarily started out as more of a survival thing for my ancestors. You know, they lived in a sod shanty, and then later, as they gained a little bit more income, they were able to build the homestead, and the farm went from just something of survival that they would use to feed their family to being more of a farm that can supply an income as people began to work off of farms and live not just off the land. Later on, it was my father who actually saw the opportunity in our area and a need for a turf operation. So he began that in 1977 alongside my mother, and they have been growing sod ever since here at Mountain View.
I think that is a pretty incredible story to hear, from a sod shanty to growing turf for your community. That is such a lineage and such a heritage, and it's so neat that you know all the way that far back to where you came from.
It's a really special connection, because we, in the winter, like a lot of farmers here, we actually do some maple syrup too, just as a little side hobby. And the trees that we tap were originally planted by my great-great-great-grandfather when he settled here at the farm. So these massive trees we can put 4 or 5 taps in were actually planted by him. And then many generations later, the maple syrup from these same trees were then boiled in what we call the horse pasture. So my grandfather and his sister would take out the horse and the big team of horses with a buggy, and they would spend the day at only a small age of like 10 and 11 years old. They would man the fire in a big cauldron outside in the horse pasture, and their mother would send them with a packed lunch and boil it into maple syrup. And so these trees now that he tapped, I'm tapping with my family now too.
That is so incredible, Lindsay. That is that just gives me goosebumps hearing that. That is so neat. This week, you'll meet Diane McKenzie.
Well, I'm from Southern Alberta. I grew up on a farm kind of up in the Champion, Alberta, Stavely, Alberta area. Grew up on a mixed farm. I attended Olds College after high school and received a diploma there. And then I went to SAIT and received a diploma there. And then I got married. I moved to Warner, Alberta, Southern Alberta, and have been here ever since. So actually not close to, it's been 40 years. I raised 3 boys. My husband started a business off farm about 25 years ago, a little bit longer.
That is a long history of being in agriculture in Alberta here. Tell us more about the research that you did while you were doing your master's, specifically around women in agriculture and girls in agriculture.
Yeah, well, I was getting more interested in women's history. And then, that was kind of tying to, like I said, the Center for Oral History and Tradition at the university and using oral history as a research method. So I was kind of honing that a little bit as well. But yeah, so between the conversations and the studying I was doing with Gordon, and then I took an oral history course from Heidi McDonald, and part of that project was doing an interview. So I interviewed a woman who farmed and had been very active in farm women organizations like of yesteryear, right? She was into her 80s, well into her 80s, I think, when I interviewed her. So that got me more and more interested in, I guess, kind of the history and I suppose the neglected history of women. I guess, like you, I thought I want to let women tell their stories, tell me about their experiences on family farms and the history, like their version of the history of their family farms that they farmed or, grew up on. Yeah. So then, and my question for my thesis was, how does the current reproduction of gender norms impede women's participation in the intergenerational transfer of the family farm? So I also decided to interview generational cohorts. So I did a younger group, kind of a middle-aged group, and a older group, because I wanted to examine I wanted to consider how some of these norms are passed generationally.
Today, you'll meet Alli Caraveo.
So my name is Alli Caraveo, and currently I live in Coffee Creek, Montana. Got my start in agriculture. I was raised in a rural town in Northern California on the Oregon border, and agriculture there was logging. So that's what my family all grew up doing, was logging and doing things in that aspect, in that avenue of the world. And then I left and fell in love with a man in Colorado, and we actually ended up moving to the middle of nowhere in Colorado in a little tiny trailer that we lived in for 4 years without electricity or running water. So we could build our dream of having our own ranch and raising our own food and being able to raise our kids on this piece of property. So yeah, I hauled water 70 miles once a week, every week for 4 years, and raised a baby in that space. And I ended up going to school and finishing my school for veterinary technology degree. So was a licensed vet tech. and had this deep, deep love of animals. I originally wanted to go to vet school. And because we started our family early, I didn't do that. I fell in love with being a stay-at-home mom and raising chickens and figuring out what it was like to have chickens and turkeys and pigs and cows and all the little things that I could possibly get to have animals around me and to create a space where I could grow my own food for my family and then move toward growing food for families around us. And that's where I got my start in agriculture.
That story, the fact that you lived in the middle of nowhere with basically no necessities or essential services for 4 years. I don't know if many people could last 4 months, let alone 4 years. Obviously, you were determined to get into ranching and start this lifestyle that you dreamed of. So walk us through the journey of how you ended up in your ranch in Coffee Creek, Montana.
So, gosh, after we got the house put in, we had another baby. I was raising 2 babies and a farm full of animals and realizing our dream was to really go into the direct-to-consumer beef business. We also were doing direct-to-consumer pork at that time. So was doing all of that. And we ran out of space, to be quite honest. The city started pushing out further and further towards us, and we couldn't afford to purchase land around us. All the land was getting pretty scarce, and we were trying to grow our herd and grow our farm. And it just wasn't something that we saw ourselves staying in that space for the rest of our lives, because of the fact that COVID hit, our lives didn't change a whole lot. We were still at home, recognizing that we loved being at home and we loved being in that space of being able to raise our own animals and food and kids and have that kind of a bubble around us almost, right? And things didn't change. One thing that did change for the better was that I could, drive to the grocery store and they'd put groceries in my car. That was the best thing on the planet, because most of your rural listeners know how hard it is to go into town and then to go into the stores and have to do all of that kind of stuff. But to be able to drive in and have people put stuff in your car was the best thing on the planet for me.
Today, you'll meet Serena Donovan.
Well, my name is Serena Donovan, and I married my husband, Ian Donovan, in 2009. He is a generational farmer in southern Alberta. We're located in Mossley. And I will admit, I knew nothing about farming prior to marrying him. I loved the idea of it. We blended a family of 5 children, and being able to raise the kids on the farm has been a real pleasure. I've always kind of lived rurally and raised my children in rural communities, but there's something different about being able to just, usher them out the door and they're good to go, and they have this ability to be outside and enjoying nature and enjoying the farm. And so my start wasn't great, probably. I mean, I had to learn a lot. And as the years progressed, I actually got my own combine so I could help combine in the fields. And I would be starting meals in the morning in the crock pot and jumping onto the combine all day and coming in with everybody and doing supper and throwing the dishes on the counter, and out the door we'd go back to the combine. And then I'd come back in and we'd clean it all up. And so harvest was probably my favorite, but obviously my most stressful time on the farm. And so, yeah, that was kind of my introduction to farming.
I love that. So you yourself, you got your own combine, you did all of the things, but you've kind of taken a different route in your farming career. So let's dive into it and start from the beginning with us. What made you go down the path that you are on today when it comes to the type of farmer that you are?
Well, it's a very windy path, and it can be a very complicated path. And so I'll go back to childhood, and I have suffered from migraines my entire life. And I remember being bedridden for days with dizziness and extreme pain. And my mom, of course, was doing everything she could for me with really no result and no answers for why. And so as I got older, of course, I progressed into adulthood and into my 40s. I figured out that there was a lot more triggers for my migraines. I was suffering 16 days a month, every single month with migraine. And I said, okay, something has to change. I have to take my health into my hands. And I found a cannabis doctor in Calgary. I made an appointment. I did not tell my family. This was prior to legalization. And I saw this doctor and she said, you know what? I think you need to start with some really high CBD oil. And if you want to add some THC, those combinations of the two really seem to work well. And so let's play around with it. It's going to be a journey. It's not a quick fix like a pill, but it can possibly offer you some relief. And within 3 months, I was down to 2 or 3 days of headache. I say this to a lot of people. I love the cannabis plant. She has given me back my life. I would not be where I am had I not found this cannabis plant.
Thanks for listening to the Rural Woman Podcast. The Rural Woman Podcast is more than just a podcast. We are a community. A huge thank you to the Rural Woman Podcast team, audio editor Max Hofer, and admin support from Kim & Co. Online. A special thanks to our Patreon executive producers, Sarah Riedner from Happiness by the Acre and Carrie Munven from Laystone Farms. To learn how you can become a Patreon executive producer or other ways to financially support the show, head on over to wildrosefarmer.com to learn more. Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen to the podcast to get the latest episodes directly on your playlist. And if you are loving the show, please be sure to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or any other platform that accepts ratings and reviews. You can connect with us on social media at The Rural Woman Podcast and with me at Wild Rose Farmer. One of the best ways you can support the show is by sharing it. Send this episode to a friend or share on your social media. Let's strengthen and amplify the voices of women in agriculture together. Until next time, my friend, keep sharing your story. Did you know that you can get this same great episode of the Rural Woman Podcast ad-free? I get it. Listening to ads during a podcast isn't always my favorite either. But in order to keep the lights and coffee pot on here at the Rural Woman Podcast Studios, they are necessary. I am so grateful to each and every one of my sponsors, but if you yourself would like to skip the ads while supporting the show, consider joining me over on Patreon. Patrons of the Rural Woman Podcast get ad-free episodes starting at Tier 5 on their podcast player of choice each week, plus some other great benefits. Find out more by heading to the link in today's show notes to learn how you can become a patron through Patreon.